So if anyone who's here for the Paul Fisher event, if you could take your seats, we're going to get started. My name's Adriana. I'm really excited to be hosting Paul Fisher tonight. He's going to be signing and discussing his new book, A Kim Jong-Il Production. So just if you guys could turn off your cell phones for me, I'd really appreciate it. Paul's going to come up here, do a little reading and discussion, and then he's going to open it up to questions from you guys. And then we'll do a book signing at the back, at the information counter in the back. And if you haven't been able to find the book, they're all at the front register. So you can just ask for them there. And that's about it. So I'm just going to introduce Paul. Paul Fisher is a writer and filmmaker. He studied film at the University of Southern California and the New York Film Academy, and his first feature film, the documentary Radio Man, won the Grand Jury Prize at Doc NYC Festival in 2013. The Kim Jong-Il Production is his first book. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Paul Fisher. Do you want it raised?
No, just like, as long as people can hear me.
Yeah, use the mic.
I think you should make it higher.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Very good. Does that work better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much for coming. I thought I'd start by reading a couple of bits from the book and talk about it really quickly, which I'm not great at doing, and then if anybody has any questions, go with that. The first kind of little passage I'll read is from early on in the book, and I'll kind of explain the second one. Here we go. Repulse Bay, on the far southern side of Hong Kong, had been used in the 19th century as a base by pirates, who preyed on the British merchant ships on their way to trade with Japan. The pirates had long ago been repulsed, hence the bay's name, and the strip of land turned into tourist beaches. Che looked out the window as their taxi drove down the deserted road. It was 4 p.m. in winter, and the air coming off the sea was cool. She could see houses in the near distance, villas and vacation homes, the nearby beach empty of people. She had no idea where they were. Suddenly, Mrs. Lee asked the taxi to stop beside a small strip of beach. "We're getting out," she said. "Should we ask the taxi to wait?" Che asked. "We can phone for one, and it'll come right away." Mrs. Lee got out of the car, Che and the little girl following. The woman stood and looked around. Che asked what was going on, but got no answer. Mrs. Lee seemed to be waiting for someone. After a minute, Che and the young girl wandered toward the sea. It was late afternoon, and their shadows were stretching across the sand. Mrs. Lee's voice rang out, calling for them. Che turned around and saw her standing by the waves about 40 yards away, motioning Che to come over. There was a group of long-haired men by her side. A small white motor skiff bobbed in the water, with more young men, all with long hair, sitting inside it, looking in her direction. Uneasily, Che walked over. Mrs. Lee explained that the man they were meeting had sent the men to take them to his secluded villa, 10 minutes away across the bay. Che hesitated. The little 12-year-old girl seemed happy enough, surely a good sign, but Che was uncomfortable. She didn't know where she was. She had only met this woman the day before. A queasy uneasiness twisted her stomach. She had been in enough bad situations to recognize that this was another. I have a 6 o'clock dinner engagement," she said. Don't worry, Mrs. Lee said, in the same agitated tone she'd had all day. "It only takes 10 minutes to get to the villa. You'll have plenty of time to get to your engagement." Che was about to reply when the men in the motorboat nodded at one another, leapt out, and grabbed her. She tried to fight, but they overpowered her and threw her into the boat. Directed to follow, Mrs. Lee and her daughter climbed in as well. The skiff's motor rumbled to life. Che was terrified. "I'm being robbed," she thought. The boat turned and headed away from the bay toward the open sea. Che turned to Mrs. Lee, but she looked serene. She put a cigarette between her lips and offered Che one. "Everything is all right," she said. One of the long-haired men called Che's name. She turned to him. He was middle-aged, probably the oldest of the group. "How do you know my name?" she asked. "I'm Korean," he said, using the North Korean term chosun rather than the South Korean term, hangruk. Che's heart sunk into her stomach. Where is this boat going? She asked in a weak voice. Madame Che, he said solemnly, we are now going to the bosom of General Kim Il-sung. What? What did you say? The man took the long-haired wig off. I said, we are going to the bosom of the great leader, Comrade General Kim Il-sung. Screaming, Che jumped to her feet, and the boat rocked side to side. Hands reached up for her and pinned her back down onto her seat. Her vision blurred, her body went limp, and she fainted. She drifted in and out of darkness. She remembered feeling someone carrying her up a gangway, someone giving her an injection, then oblivion swallowing her back up. When she finally woke, she was aboard a freighter in the captain's cabin. A large ceremonial portrait of Kim Il-sung smiled down at her. She was on the ship for 6 days, a doctor and his wife looking after her and managing her shock, and 2 other men, including the middle-aged man from the boat, whom she later learned was Im Ho-gun, Deputy Director of North Korea's Covert Operations Department, keeping a 24-hour watch on her. Che could hear Mrs. Lee sobbing in the next cabin, and gathered that she had agreed to help the men take Che, but had not foreseen they would force her to come along. Che, too, cried. She couldn't eat, but forced herself to drink the broth of the noodle soup that they brought her. On the 4th day, they took her up to the deck, and she stared into the ocean, trying to gather the strength to throw herself in. On the 5th day, a typhoon forced the boat to drop anchor, and she watched the storm pass. At 3 p.m. on the 6th day, January 22nd, 1978, the ship pulled into Nampo Harbor, North Korea. They unloaded Madame Che onto another small white motorboat, which took her to a small quay, a 20-minute ride from the main port. Her legs wobbled as she stepped onto the pier. She followed the guards with her head bowed, struggling to stay on her feet. Someone important is coming, one of them whispered. A short man, in his mid-30s, was walking toward her. He wore a thick, fashionable wool coat over a dark Mao-collared uniform. A shiny Mercedes idled behind him, and a photographer stood by his side, camera ready. With a smile, the small man extended his hand to her. Thank you for coming, Madame Che, he said. You must be exhausted from the journey. Welcome. I am Kim Jong-Il. So that's the first bit. And I thought I'd read you another bit that is a bit further along in the story. Jane, he was an actress and she was kidnapped in North Korea. And her ex-husband was a filmmaker, disappeared a few months later. And they were kept separate for several years until it was decided that they had shown sufficient proof that they had accepted the re-education and brainwashing they'd been put through, at which point they were brought back together, which is the point in the story where I will read another short bit from. Right after breakfast on February 23rd, 1983, a guard opened Shin's cell door and let him out. He was taken to have a bath, then handed the wrinkled brown suit he had been arrested in, and told to change, after which the guards walked him to the building's visiting room. 3 men waited for him, an inspector Shin had met before, an official in a Mao tunic, and as always, the trustee, Choi, in the corner. The inspector made small talk for a while, asking Shin about his health, and then the man in the Mao tunic cracked open his briefcase and took out a single sheet of paper. Please stand at attention and listen to this carefully while I read it, he asked. Holding it before him, he read out, loudly and with authority, Comrade, despite the fact that you have committed a serious crime, we will forgive you. Therefore, you shall now devote yourself to the great leader and to contributing to the completion of the revolutionary task of the Juche fatherland. Signed, Kim Jong-il, February 23rd, 1983. No sooner had the briefcase snapped shut than Shin found himself outside, faced with the ubiquitous Mercedes, this one blue and brand new. Shin got in. As the car pulled away, he kept his eyes on the prison building, the car's back window framing it like a widescreen moving picture, until it disappeared from sight. Taken to a People's Security safe house, Shin was made to take the oath of loyalty, and then gradually restored to health by large meals and material comforts. He was given new clothes, a medical checkup, and a haircut. On March 6th, a mere 10 days after arriving at the safe house, he was told to prepare to meet the dear leader. He was going to his first Kim Jong-il party. Che had already arrived at the fish house. The gala was like every other that she'd attended in her 5 years in Pyongyang, only bigger, filling the whole of the large banquet hall, with twice the usual number of guests in attendance. There was trepidation in the air, too. Kim Jong-il looked especially pleased with himself. Earlier in the evening, someone had come up to Che, taken her elbow, and said, "Today will be the happiest day of your life." Che shrugged it off. By now, she was used to the North Korean propensity for elation and exaggeration. Shin was tense and anxious as the car drove up to the concrete building, outside of which were parked a long row of identical Mercedes-Benzes. He stepped out of the car and walked up to the entrance. 2 attendants bowed their heads and opened the door for him. As soon as he entered, the packed banquet hall broke into applause. He looked around in bewilderment. 10 days before, he had been sitting in the torture position inside a prison camp, starved of food, the screams of prisoners being tortured and executed waking him up at night. And now he was in a room that felt like, he said, a luxurious nightclub in Seoul, filled with men in uniforms or in identical Western suits, with identical red flag pins bolted to their chests, drunk on the most expensive liquors in the world, gorging on the most luxurious variety of dishes. Teenage girls danced, flirted, and giggled their way from table to table. Standing at the center of it all was Kim Jong-il, the man who had imprisoned him for years and who had now inexplicably brought him here. I had seen pictures and paintings of Kim Jong-il numerous times, Shin later wrote, but this was the first time I'd ever seen him in person. He was small and had big, bright eyes. His skin was flushed, as if he was beginning to show the effects of alcohol. He wore a tunic consisting of comfortable trousers and a loose button-up shirt, an ensemble almost resembling pajamas. He smiled in greeting. Shin began to make his way toward him. Che missed the arrival of the evening's special guest. When the music stopped abruptly and the crowd erupted into applause, she didn't think to take notice until a woman approached her and pointed toward the door. "Look who's here," she said. Che turned to the entrance. A very gaunt man stood there. She didn't recognize him at first, then she froze. It felt like her heart had stopped. "Why are you just standing there?" the woman asked, dragging her forward. Shin was approaching Kim Jong-il, his pulse racing, when he suddenly caught sight of Che. She was wearing a traditional white hanbok dress and huge smokily tinted sunglasses. Until tonight, he hadn't seen her in over 5 years, and he had never been sure that she was actually in the country, or even still alive. He stared in blank disbelief as she was pulled toward him. They both stood there, not knowing what to say or do, agonizingly aware of the dozens of eyes glued to them. Silence and a stifling stillness had replaced the applause. "What happened to you?" Choi finally managed. Shin smiled weakly. Jong-il lingered nearby, an enormous grin on his face, looking like a kid who had just pulled off the most improbable prank. "Well, go ahead and hug each other," he said. "Why are you just standing there?" Shin and Che hugged, awkwardly at first, and then sank into the comfort of each other's arms. Cheers and applause broke out again. Flashbulbs popped. All right, stop hugging, come over here," Jong-il ordered. Shin and Che did as they were told, keenly aware of being on show. Shin gave a polite bow to Kim and shook the younger man's hand. Jong-il heartily squeezed Shin's. Placing Shin on his left and Che on his right, Jong-il made them pose for a picture. "Relax," he joked. "This won't end up in the South Korean papers." And then turned to the crowd. "Comrades," he announced. "From now on, Mr. Shin is my film advisor." Deafening applause. "And Madame Che is now a representative for our Korean women." More applause. Jong-il looked from Shin to Che. "And let's have a wedding ceremony for you, on April 15th, the great leader's birthday." Shin stared, stupefied, as the riotous applause continued. It was March 6, 1983. Had he and Che never divorced, today would have been the eve of their 29th wedding anniversary. The dear leader had directed his little scene to perfection. Thank you. I came across this story. I'm a filmmaker by day, and came across this story in articles about Kim Jong-il that always seemed to be about a proper news story, and then at the end of the article will be a sort of coda about something crazy Kim Jong-il does. There seemed to be a rule that you have to have an article, and then, Kim Jong-il drinks so much cognac, Kim Jong-il does this, he's done that. And one of them was always that he'd kidnapped his favorite filmmaker, which I found very intriguing. And I was always fascinated by the idea of being a down-and-out filmmaker and someone, giving you the opportunity forcibly to make films that would support them, and in exchange you would get all the resources in the world, no questions asked. And that seemed like an interesting kind of Faustian pact to me. And it kind of kicked around my head for a while until I actually looked into the details and discovered something I didn't expect, which was this whole story of someone who is fascinated with storytelling and visual language creating a state and its legitimacy kind of out of nothing, and how those layers fed into this story. And I was fascinated from then on, and wanted to do everything I could to not just research the kidnapping, but also kind of trying to understand North Korea better and understand all the things that I didn't understand all that well beforehand, that I felt like this story kind of shined a light on. And hopefully managed to mix that first layer of story with things that are hopefully revealing about North Korea today. There you go, that's how I got into it. And if any of you have questions, I'm all ears. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
So, given what happened with the interview, are you tempted to make this story into a film?
I made this into a book rather than a film because it felt like I would have to lose so much to cram it into 2 hours. Mm-hmm. And there are plenty of people who have been in touch and are in touch about maybe making a film out of it, but I think, now everyone's worried they'll be hacked or threatened or anything like that.
Has Kim Jong-Il contacted you to make a film of it?
No, I think, I don't even know that they're aware of this, really. Usually when they put out a kind of strongly worded statement calling you a liar, that's when they're aware that you exist, which they haven't done about this yet. But I think beyond the hack, it's a story about 3 Asian people, 2 of which are in their 50s, one of which is 5'2". I think most people's casting sheets for what names would sell a film don't match those roles. So I don't imagine that anyone would be able to kind of put the budget and put the resources into making it. And these stories kind of, you can't show it in China, it's a North Korean story, it's kind of touchy. So there's kind of a lot of problems to making it into a film that I hope someone will kind of have answers to. But I kind of don't envy that job, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I missed anything. For the process of writing it, did you first track down that couple and then interview them? And what else was involved? I spoke to a lot of people who told me they hadn't been kidnapped, or that they'd heard they hadn't been kidnapped, and that the rumor was they'd made up the kidnapping story. So I spent the first few months, they had written a memoir in Korean, or had a memoir ghostwritten in Korean when they escaped, to kind of put forward their side of the story. And I spent a few months, I got that translated because they hadn't really made much of a splash outside Korea, and tried to double check everything and tried to see if there was validity to the story as they told it. And once I determined that, I got in touch with Jong-Il, who's the only one of the 2 who's still alive, and got her cooperation, got her to allow me to interview her and kind of cross-examine her and ask her a million questions and look at all the pictures she'd left with and all that kind of thing. And then I went, as much as I could, to everywhere that the story takes place. And I went to North Korea for a while, and I went to South Korea. And there was a lot of research kind of involved in understanding North Korea in the bigger picture, even if it wouldn't end up in the book, and then understanding kind of film history in both Koreas, even if it wouldn't end up in the book. And I was kind of trying to condense 100 years of history into that first 50, 60 pages without holding it up, so that once they get kidnapped and the story kicks along, it's not kind of a hollow thing, but you understand the implications. And went to Hong Kong, went to Vienna, stayed in the hotel room that they stayed in when they tried to escape. They had been sent to London Film Festival, so I tracked down pictures and the people there who arranged their visas, and I found the CIA guy who debriefed them once they did escape. And I just worked really hard, originally from a place of trying to make sure I wasn't writing a book about something that never happened, but then it just kind of helped to find detail and find layers and find things that put the story into context and revealed to Jong-Il stuff that maybe she hadn't known or thought about beyond what she'd gone through. You're convinced it's all true after all that?
I am, yeah. There's a sort of afterword at the end of the book that kind of puts forward the case as they see it for why they were, in my opinion, they were kidnapped. There's no real evidence for them not having been kidnapped. There's theories, and there's not a shred of even circumstantial evidence for them not having been kidnapped, whereas there's a lot of things in their account that they wouldn't have known if it hadn't happened. A lot of things that, Madame Che said she'd met people who said they'd been kidnapped in North Korea, that it turned out, matched people who had disappeared on a day that she said, who had been kidnapped, and the methods all matched North Korean kidnapping methods and modus operandi that hadn't been public then, and the dates check out, and everything I could find checks out, in a sense. There's no gaps in their story, and there's stuff about it that matches things that we know now. Obviously, they're the only people who were there, and unless there are documents in North Korea that say, prove they defected and weren't kidnapped, it's impossible to know for sure 100%. But, they're high-ranking North Korean officials who've defected since and who've categorically told me and other people that, they were kidnapped. We heard about the plan. There was a plan to kidnap them, and they were kidnapped, as we were always told. And I have no incentive to lie or make something like that up. But I tried to be quite thorough, so there's a fairly kind of indulgent afterword at the end of the book, kind of going through why I think it happened. Yeah. Yes. Sorry.
What's your take on the kind of contradiction of the dear leader who makes this really fantastic anti-war movie, an anti-militarist film, Pulgasari, and at the same time he's the head of an authoritarian state? I mean, what's your take on that contradiction?
It's kind of revealing of him as, a filmmaker and as a leader. The reason he had to kidnap these people, as far as he said it, in a tape recording they made of him, was that his filmmakers weren't able to make good films because they were restricted by the propaganda rules. But he was the one who had decided on the propaganda rules, and he was kind of needing somebody to come in and do things he knew needed doing, but he didn't feel comfortable changing himself, because that would mean admitting that he was wrong. And that was one of the aspects that was fascinating to me about Kim Jong-Il as a sort of character in this story, is that there's limited reliable sources about him and what he was like and what his sort of life was like. And those sources paint a picture of someone who is extremely contradictory. It's kind of to oversimplify, he wanted to be, a kind of softy, compassionate artist. And he was funny and he was charming, but at the same time was horrible, cruel, very ruthless and very deliberate in how he plotted to get rid of people. And I think Pulgasari and all the films they made for him are kind of a reflection of that. I think it comes from maybe him giving them free hand to do things that he didn't expect would backfire in some small way. And from him trying to reconcile the idea that these films had to serve propaganda, but also had to be able to do something else to be better than just propaganda. And I don't know if the book kind of throws up more questions than answers. I was really careful that I didn't want to kind of play Psychology 101 and just paint a well-rounded, completely untruthful Kim Jong-Il. But he was a very inconsistent, contradictory person. There's one person I spoke to who did a lot of research into people who had been close to Kim Jong-Il and defected, and spoke of him, and one of the things he told me was that everyone has a different image of this guy. There's some constants, but otherwise it could be as if everyone's talking about a different person, because some people say he's lovely, he's friendly, he's charming, he looked after us. Other people describe him as cruel, ruthless, awful, sometimes both in the same sentence. And he had this sort of impact on people where Shin and Che liked him enough that they apologized to him for escaping while they still hated him for kidnapping them in the first place. And he had a way of sort of putting conflicting emotions into people, which I think was part of his charisma, that we maybe don't see from the outside, from what we perceive of him.
Do you think, I mean, because he built this huge studio and he did all these fabulous Busby Berkeley type films and the stadiums with thousands and thousands of actors that were, just inconceivable for any director to be able to control that kind of a situation right now. Because of the cost, if nothing else. It looks like he had the entire Korean army at his disposal for some of his films. I mean, do you think that deep down, that at some point that he was creating like a legend for himself, maybe for the future, saying if somebody ever looked back on him, there would be, they would see some of the things that he did, and maybe look at him in a different light. It's like he's stuck in this straitjacket of having to rule this country,
Right.
an authoritarian country, but that underneath he had all these, aspirations to make films. I mean, he was obviously a huge film buff.
Yeah, I think it's I've thought about it in that sense, and that feels like it could almost be true, except for the fact that he didn't have to take over. There were other people when he was younger who were in better positions to succeed his father, and he, plotted very deliberately over a very long period of time to get rid of them so he could take over. And there's a very possible alternate life for Kim Jong-Il where, he ran the propaganda film studios. That's all he did. He was one of the culture guys, and his half brother took over, that sort of thing. But that didn't happen because he really pursued power, and all the creative things he did at the end of the day were a way to create power and reinforce power. And the softer kind of I want to be a filmmaker and artist sides of him seem to have been, a kind of undertone and aftertone to the more megalomaniacal, ruthless, paranoid sides of him.
I mean, you think it was like a secret life that he fantasized, and maybe, just got this power so that he could do all these other things without anybody saying anything to him?
I think he would, it's hard to tell, but I think he was able to do them even if he hadn't taken over. He was making films, he was following the rules. He's not someone who wanted in any way to kind of, use the system to turn the system over its head. Everything he did was to reinforce the system, and a system that would serve him and serve his family. Obviously it's all myth-making, because the Kims have not done anything that they say they've done. They're not who they say they are. But it's more of a collective family myth-making to asserting sort of power over the country. Yeah.
How does one travel to North Korea to engage in this kind of research, and how do you do research there authentically without worrying about raising eyebrows or attracting attention?
So the thing is, you don't speak to anyone who's kind of a normal, real person. So you end up kind of doing research into and through how they try and micromanage how you perceive them, as opposed to the reality. Which, there are people who've written books about kind of real life in North Korea, and they've interviewed defectors, or they've smuggled things in, or smuggled cameras in. And for me, I was interested in that aspect, and I spoke to defectors and spoke to people who'd left as much as I could. But I was also interested in, they've built this narrative story for themselves. How do they kind of try and control how it's perceived? And so the simple answer is they do accept tourists. And there's kind of a debate about whether people should go as tourists, because you don't see anything real. All your money, however small it is, goes to supporting the regime. And I think for me, I couldn't write the book about somewhere without going there and really standing there. And what I did is, because I'm a filmmaker, there's visas in my passport that say I'm a filmmaker. We told them I was a filmmaker, and I was looking to maybe make a co-production with them. So could they show me all the film stuff? Could they show me the film studios? Could I ask questions about film stuff? Could they take me to find the film books, the official propaganda film books, biographies of Kim Jong-Il, all that kind of stuff? And they agreed to that, as long as I didn't film a film while I was there, or didn't try to break the rules. So I spent 10 days there, and they showed me around, and they showed me the studios, and some big honcho at the studio met me and showed me around and asked me if I had any questions or maps I wanted to see, anything like that. And yeah, they were really concerned about me filming anything, but not at all about me writing anything down or that sort of thing. And so it was really useful because I was able to see Pyongyang's fake, it's a stage, and I was able to see how they kind of try and convince you that it is, and just the whole feeling of a place where everyone's acting, and people are dying and starving right behind that curtain, but you're on stage, so no one kind of acknowledges it. And the feeling of being in a city where there's no traffic, there's no people, there's no old people, there's no disabled people, there's no pets, there's no filth, there's no, it's a very deliberately created city. So to be there helped, and then to go to all the propaganda places helped, and to be able to buy a map and see the studios where they worked helped, and they still have, Kim Jong-il's biography kind of changed over the years as they kind of refined their idea of who he was for the purposes of propaganda. and I was able to buy different versions of that. You know, the way you'd buy, you know, like the original Star Wars and then special edition, and then, you know, I was able to buy those and then see the difference, and kind of match that up to how he built his own image. And there are old pictures in them and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, even though you don't see anything real, you see this weird kind of funhouse mirror that they hold up to the reel to kind of reveal something about the reel and how they try to control it. And yeah, it wasn't dangerous in any way. I think, you know, I'm not American, so I have no bargaining value whatsoever. And then as long as you didn't break the rules at the time, there was a feeling that, you know, you were fine, really. You know, if you didn't bring a Bible in or bring propaganda in, that you were fine asking questions. That was a problem.
So you weren't able to, you have no footage of when you were actually in North Korea?
I do, yeah. I took my iPhone in
Okay.
and filmed stuff anyway. But
And
they're
you
just
thought about putting together like a little documentary of the making of your, you know, of your book, of writing, all the research you did?
yeah. I think I've thought about it. It's not kind of keeping me up at night in a way that it feels like I would want to spend time to focus on it. And also, there's so many documentaries that kind of have that feel of, you know, smuggled in shaky phone footage, and at the end of the day, it's footage of the same stuff. That I don't know that it would add anything to it beyond me saying how I found it. If that makes sense. You know, we had an idea of trying to do exactly what I did essentially, but with cameras, to tell them we want to make a co-production in North Korea. We were going to make up some kind of film they wanted to make there, kind of Argo style. Can we come and look around and visit and take footage like a location scout, and then use that and turn that into a documentary, which we were going to do with the BBC for a while, and that never really happened for lack of kind of time and all those sorts of things. And you know, I don't have tons of footage, and it's, you know, it's the kind of shaky camera stuff that's not that representative. You know, sadly, you need to kind of pepper it with a voiceover and old pictures and kind of dress it up, you know, to make it something worth making a film out of.
So did you just travel there by yourself, or did you?
Yeah, I went by myself. I found a guy in Beijing who used to work for one of the tourist places. Told him what I wanted to do. Honestly, he helped me, you know, figure out what I could tell them and not tell them, and what would be fine or not. And then I went by myself. Yeah, so I'd have a more tailored experience. And I got lucky. They assign 2 guides to you when you get there, 2 minders who stay with you wherever you go. And you have 2 so they can watch you, but also watch each other in case one of them kind of wants to escape or do something treasonous. But they assign them to you by passport, and I'm Swiss. So I arrived there and I was assigned 2 guides who speak German, which I don't speak. And they were only able to switch one of them out for an English-speaking one. And because she knew the other guy couldn't understand her, she was a lot freer in the stuff she talked to me about. And they weren't huge things, but again, they were kind of revealing of how much she knew that what she had to tell me wasn't true. How much she knew that she was upholding a fiction and not brainwashed and believed it, if that makes sense. And you know, it's kind of a very emotional thing because she had like a 10-year-old son that she was very aware that she was lying to every day to keep him safe. But she also bought into the idea they're told that reunification will come any day. You know, borders will go down and we'll be able to open ourselves to the world. And she was convinced that when that happened, she had basically, you know, made a useless son, a son who wouldn't be able to cope in reality. So she was very anxious about, you know, how I made a living, you know, how I paid for the films I've got on my iPhone. If everybody has that phone, if you're free to do anything on that phone. You know, some guy from Hong Kong told me to have vacuum cleaners who do stuff themselves. Is that true? Is that how advanced it is outside? What's South Korea like? You know, she asked me a lot of questions that were more revealing than if I asked her questions, if that makes sense. And yeah, it was just me and the 2 of them and a driver for 10 days. And oddly, after 3 or 4 days, you kind of get the idea. Just with them, monument, go outside of Pyongyang, monument. And it was kind of a perfect amount of time for my purposes.
So they were both North Korean.
They were both North Korean.
But
She,
they just, you know,
yeah. So essentially, she had to find a job because there weren't enough rations in her husband's factory job. They were coming the way they used to. That, you know, she was, and they were both parts of the elite. To be a guide, you have to be in the highest echelon of the social caste system. So they were well off. And so it had only been 2 or 3 years that she'd been a guide. And to do so, you apply, and if you get security clearance, they teach you the language, teach you what to say, and And so that's how she came to be a guide. And then the younger guy was fresh out university, where he'd learned German. And because he'd learned languages, that's one of the jobs that they're offered or assigned to, is to be a guide. And the only conversation, there was only 2 conversations I had with him that we kind of managed in German, English, broken. One of them was about skiing and about his family holidays up in the hills and how they have beer for breakfast and shoot moose and deer and how awesome it is. And it was kind of a very weird, kind of posh holiday extravaganza thing he was describing. And another, which was also revealing, was he kept wanting to ask me about WikiLeaks that he'd heard about at school, and he didn't understand how this guy could say bad things about our governments, but we don't kill him or send him to prison, and why are we so weak, and how does that function, and how does anybody respect our leaders if somebody can say that and they don't end up shot somewhere, which is a fairly creepy conversation, that one. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, do you feel like your life is in danger?
No, no, yeah, no. I think, I didn't really break, I kind of pushed the rules but didn't break the rules. And I do really think, most of the people they take either break the rules or they're American and they can kind of use them as bargaining chips, which I was never kind of in that position.
Do you think that because that time period where the dear leader was in charge and he was very aware of Western ideas, film, tradition, because he was such a film fanatic, really. I heard that he had about at least 20,000 videos and DVDs.
Right.
So did the United States maybe miss an opportunity there because there was all of a sudden this window where there was a leadership situation where the leader was interested in, at least in some level, Western film and tradition, and did we just blow it by not kind of, trying to understand and make more inroads with him when he was in position, because now his son doesn't seem to be anything like his father. It's like reverted to a more authoritarian thing, if that's possible. So do you think we missed an opportunity there somehow?
No, I actually think every opportunity Kim Jong-il had to take advantage of anybody, opening up to him, he took advantage and milked for all it's worth and used selfishly. And he didn't, he never gave any indication of having any productive desire to bring anything else about other than his own power. And the Kim regime under him wasn't a socialist regime, it wasn't a valid regime. They're a crime family doing criminal things, using the state's apparatus to be able to do so. So there's no kind of peaceful, opening into the legal system that would have allowed him to keep on doing that. And like his father, he was very good at playing China and Russia against one another and, go what he needed from them more or less until the very late years. And then, really didn't need to open up. And if he did open up, it was to take advantage. And his perspective of Western culture was warped because he'd never gone anywhere normally, never spoken to anybody normal. He told Shin once, or gave him the impression once, that he was convinced, James Bond films were basically docudramas about how covert operations are conducted in the West. And so he had this kind of bizarre, he had a view of the West that none of his people had, but it was very deformed and inaccurate.
Wait a minute, he liked Elvis.
Yeah, he liked Elvis, loved Elvis Taylor, Sean Connery, but not in any way that I think would translate to, wanting to go to Graceland on a holiday. I think it was this big image of power and success and charisma and creativity. The way
He might have wanted to go to Graceland, but that would have been a tough thing for him to do.
And that's the thing. I traveled abroad once, and that's why now if the younger guy goes to Russia, that's a big thing because it doesn't happen that often to these guys to go abroad, and it's because everything they do is so controlled. That even going to Russia or going to China or going to be with other world leaders, that's not a situation they can control as well, and that's how tightly choreographed the narrative is, that it's a risk to send someone to a state function somewhere else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm sure the answer is no, but I was just curious if there was any sort of action either by the UN or South Korea taken against Kim Jong-il after they figured out that he had kidnapped these people.
The South Koreans didn't do anything except kind of, statements and condemn them and kind of exchanged barbs about, you're a liar, you're a liar. Because Kim Jong-il claimed that they'd never been kidnapped, that they'd defected voluntarily, and then tricked them and ran away with the film production money. And the South Korean government was fairly resentful of Shin and Che because they chose to come here and to take CIA protection as opposed to go back to South Korea. And so it didn't protect them all that much, which is one of the reasons people in South Korea don't believe them. Because, you know, in South Korea, until much later, no one really spoke up to say this happened. It's a fact. And up until very, very recently, no one believed the kidnapping stories. You know, North Koreans used to kidnap people just left, right, and center. Japanese, South Korean, Lebanese, French, Italian. There's documented cases that were reported then. In some cases, we had to return the people with apologies, saying it was all a big misunderstanding. But it's only until kind of fairly recently, and under the late summits of Kim Jong-Il's life, that the Japanese government pushed the issue, and that the North Koreans admitted that they'd kidnapped a handful. That's as much as they'll admit. And the South Korean government, for some reason, doesn't make an issue of it. I've heard people tell me this because they know they've done similar things during the Cold War, and no one wants to open, you know, that closet full of skeletons. But yeah, Shin and Che were kind of on their own. It's fairly certain there was a price on their head for a while. They had live-in CIA agents looking after them, and they had to be smuggled out of Europe in disguise, and lived in Virginia for a while under, you know, state protection. And you know, then it all kind of died down, really. Yeah.
Is it possible to see any of the films they made while they were there, or have they been translated, or?
Pulgasar is on YouTube, and it can be bought on DVD and VHS, and it's subtitled, because it actually came out here. It came out in Japan, like, long after they escaped, as a sort of spoof, and they kind of sold it as a spoof, throwback Godzilla B-movie thing, and it was hugely successful in Japan. And then here it's going to become like a VHS, you know, terrible cult classic underground thing. So that's on YouTube. And then the others, there's clips on YouTube, and they can be bought as kind of over-expensive bootleg DVDs from a variety of North Korean websites. But the quality is really bad, and they're not subtitled. And yeah, it's more effort than it's worth for those. Yeah.
Did you ever go back again?
I don't think they'd let me in, because I think, you know, they'd have guys, they'd Google it, they wouldn't let me in, and, you know, in this case I'd be worried if they did let me in. So I'd love to, but I don't think it's going to happen, really. Yeah, let's keep that.
Yeah, they make you write another version.
Yeah, exactly. They'd make me, exactly, write how this was lies, and, you know, yeah, republish it. Yeah. Cool, thank you. Yeah, you know, I'm going to be sitting back there.
Okay, thank you guys for coming. Again, the books are up for available for purchase at the front register, and we're going to do a signing at the information counter in the back. So thank you guys.